The United Nations estimates that the world's population will never reach 13 billion human beings, almost twice what it is now. Even so, there is only a 24% chance that humanity will stop growing before the year 2100. Much of the population growth obviously will not come from Europe, North or South America. Many think that China and India are two potential head problems, each country surpassing a population of 1.3 billion inhabitants. Maybe we should only worry about India, since China, for the next couple years, will see its population fall. On the other hand, India could easily reach 2 billion people by 2070, the date on which its population should begin to decline. So, India adds a little more than 15 million inhabitants every single year, but relatively, that demographic growth isn't all that high. In fact, it's only 1.87%. The country does not even appear among the 20 countries with the highest population growth in the world. A growing population, together with correct policies, can turn a country into an emerging power like Indonesia or China. But growing too large, too quick, without a plan, could be dangerous. Rapid population growth in impoverished nations is an obstacle to achieving prosperity. The high population growth rates in poor countries also impose a greater burden on their governments as they try to stretch their limited resources and infrastructure. If we add to the fact that strong corruption or dictatorships tend to appear in these types of nations, it's a recipe for poverty. So today, we will see the 10 countries with the highest population growth rates in the world. Let's begin. Number 10, Angola. Population, 30 million, annual growth rate, 3.3%. Angola was one of the few Portuguese colonies in Africa, but it was still a brutal victim of Portuguese colonial exploitation. It was under Portugal's rule until just 1974, the effective year of its independence, following 13 years of war with Portugal. Angola is one of the most blessed countries in Africa in terms of its natural resources. It has large reserves of oil and gas, as well as being one of the fastest growing economies on the African continent. Angola is one of the largest exporters and producers of oil in the world. They currently produce about 2 million barrels per day, almost doubling the production of oil from Venezuela. The average age of Angola is extremely young at just 17.9 years old. That is, 58% of the population does not exceed the legal limit of 18 years. Here you can see Angola's population diagram. The surprising thing is that, for example, only 1% of the population is over 65 years of age. The population of Angola is expected to reach 65 million by 2050. The curious thing is, the data corroborates that even by 2050, the population over 65 years of age will not exceed 3%. If this trend continues, Angola could reach 138 million inhabitants by 2100. Number 9, Iraq. Population, 38 million. Population growth rate, 3.31%. Despite being a country that was hit hard by the US military invasion in 2003, and after suffering a civil war for more than 10 years as a result of the invasion that claimed more than 1 million Iraqi lives, Iraq still has one of the world's highest population growth rates. A country highly rich in hydrocarbons such as oil, the country still hasn't stabilized completely after the US invasion. Although the country lives under a quote-unquote democracy, it is highly volatile and corrupt. A part of Iraq is divided into Kurdistan, and if this is taken into account for this ranking, the country has an economic growth rate of between 8 to 11%, among the highest in the world. The average age of an Iraqi is set at 19.8 years old, and its population is broken down like so. As you can see, despite having a population growth that is faster than that of Angola, Iraq's population pyramid is a little better distributed. The largest proportion of people are still infants between 0 to 4 years old, which make up 16% of the population, and the percentage of people over 65 hardly exceeds 3.2%. The population of Iraq will reach 83 million by 2050 and 163 million by 2100, surpassing Angola. At number 8, Chad. Population, 15 million. Population growth rate, 3.31%. Chad is a landlocked country located in the middle of Central Africa or Saharan Africa. It is sadly one of the poorest countries on Earth, the 5th to be exact. Angola, for example, has a GDP that's almost 9 times more than that of Chad. Chad was a former French colony up until 1960. Despite France's countless military and economic aid, Chad remains one of the most corrupt nations on Earth. The country is heavily agitated by political violence and climate change. This country has few oil reserves, barely $1 billion worth, but American companies are already exploiting these reserves. Now looking at Chad's population pyramid, which is very similar to that of Angola, it has about 20% of the population being less than 5 years of age. Again, people over 65 do not reach even 2%, and Chad's average age is just 17.8 years. The population of Chad will reach 35 million by 2050 and 70 million by 2100. The case of Chad is different from that of Angola or even Iraq, since both countries have strong reserves of hydrocarbons with which it finances this population growth. In addition, both countries have strong rates of economic growth of between 7 and 10%, and they will be future regional powers. Chad does not have prominent resources, and even then, in about 70 years, its population will quadruple. Number 7. Burundi. Population 12 million, population growth rate 3.34%. If you have never heard of this country, don't worry. It is one of the smallest nations in the world and is located in Central East of Africa. But it is also the third poorest nation on Earth with one of the lowest GDP per capita in the world. Burundi only has about 27,000 square kilometers of land, which is practically nothing compared to its African neighbors. It's incredible to think that this space fits a population of about 12 million people. Therefore, it has one of the largest population densities in the world with about 400 inhabitants per kilometer square, which would make it the 20th densest nation on Earth. But if you were surprised to hear that, then look at Burundi's population pyramid. Like Chad, Burundi's population pyramid presents only a few differences, except for the part that the average age of a Burundi is only 16.9 years old. With this current trend, in 2050, Burundi will have about 30 million inhabitants, and in 2100, more than 62 million in just 27,000 square kilometers. If Chad was to multiply the population by 4 in 70 years, Burundi will multiply by 6 in the same amount of time. In 2100, Burundi will have the same population as modern-day Colombia and Chile combined. Number 6. Niger. Population 21 million, population growth rate 4%. In the previous case, we mentioned that Burundi is the third poorest nation in the world. Well, Niger is number 2. It was a former French colony and is located in the middle of sub-Saharan Africa. It is a large country comparable to the territory of Colombia, but being located in the middle of the Sahara, only 3.9% of the land is suitable for agriculture. More than 85% of the population depends on just 3.9% of arable land. More than 75% of the population live in subhuman conditions, with a GDP per capita of just $340, which is 3 times less than Haiti. The country is emerging as one of the poorest nations in the world that will experience a population boom. At the moment, the average age of Niger is around 17.5 years. Now, let's take a look at their population pyramid. As you can see, it is very disproportionate. Even the bar leaves the proposed axis. More than 20% of the population is under 4 years old, and 61% of the population is underage. If the demographic trend of Niger continues until 2050, then the country will have 72 million inhabitants, and by 2100, they will attain an absolutely gargantuan population of 210 million inhabitants, which would equal to Brazil's current population. Thus, Niger will be one of the few countries that will increase their population tenfold in the next 70 years. Number 5. South Sudan. Population 13 million, population growth rate 4.09%. South Sudan is a relatively new country. It had once belonged to the old Sudan, but after a bloody civil war between the Christians in the south and the Muslim majority in the north, they had decided to separate the country. When Sudan achieved its independence, it took away the wealth of oil resources that were located in the south of the country. Its GDP per capita is barely $246, one of the lowest in the world, 3 times less than that of Haiti. It is practically considered as a failed state along with Somalia. South Sudan and Sudan share a mutual debt of $38 billion that has not yet been decided on how it would be divided. This debt represents 20 times the GDP of South Sudan, which isn't entirely surprising since it is one of the poorest nations on Earth. With an average age of 18.7 years, South Sudan will have considerable growth. Let's see its population pyramid. South Sudan has a population pyramid of a young country, but not of such a radical proportion as the country we saw earlier. For this same reason, even if 16% of the population is less than 4 years old, the country's growth will still multiply, but not as abruptly. Thus, in 2050, South Sudan will have 25 million inhabitants, and by 2100, 41 million. That is a 350% growth. Number 4. Qatar. Population 2.3 million, growth rate 4.72%. Qatar is one of the richest countries on the planet. It is number 6 in leading countries in terms of GDP per capita with $65,000 per person. This virtually doubles Italy and is only behind countries such as Luxembourg, Norway, and Switzerland. So what is this country doing on this list? Qatar's success, as it is very well known, is sourced from its strong oil reserves, which they use to invest in infrastructure, to diversify its economy, to open up to the world and attract millions of highly trained foreigners. In fact, 94% of the population lives in their capital Doha, and 88% of the population here is foreign. A large portion of the population is made up of Indians, about 700,000 of them, participating in infrastructure construction work such as the stadium for the 2022 World Cup, which will have one of the most expensive investments in the tournament's history, which will surpass $30 billion. Precisely because of this type of immigration, the population pyramid of Qatar is different from the previous countries on this list. Take a look. As you can see, there are clear important disparities. There are 6 times more men than women between the ages of 25 and 29, and 4 times more between 33 and 34. Most workers leave their families in their country of origin to work in Qatar to be able to help them financially. Thus, the average age of Qatar is 31 years old. But as Qatar evidently does not have a young population, the country experiences a massive growth of skilled and unskilled workers, but this growth will have to stop sometime. At this current rate, the country will grow to at least 2.9 million inhabitants by 2100. Number 3, Kuwait. Population 4 million, growth rate 4.81%. Kuwait is a small Arab state rich in oil and other hydrocarbons. Despite having just 17,000 square kilometers, making it one of the smallest countries on earth, it has vast oil reserves with 104 billion barrels. Kuwait is one of the most educated countries in the Gulf and is similar to Qatar. The high growth of the economy is one of the factors that affect investors and the labor force. 70% of Kuwait's population is foreign and has an average age of 33 years. After looking at the demographic pyramid, we can see that Kuwait has a slightly more balanced distribution than Qatar, for example. Even so, the majority of the population is made up of men. In 2050, the country will have 6 million inhabitants, and in 2100, it will have about 7 million, 50% more than now. Number 2, Lebanon. Population 6 million, growth rate 6%. Lebanon is a small country in the Middle East with just 4.5 million people before the start of the Syrian civil war. Due to the civil war of its neighbor country, Lebanon obtained more than 1.5 million immigrants or refugees, increasing Lebanon's population exponentially in just a few years. This obviously creates a huge fiscal and economic pressure. Currently, Lebanon is among the 10 most indebted countries in the world. So, let's take a look at their population pyramid. We can see that the population of Lebanon is distributed in an equitable manner, being a rare exception within this ranking. As it is to be expected, millions of Syrians will return to their country after the war. The population of the country will be reduced to 5.6 million in 2050 and back to 4.6 million in 2100. Number 1, Oman. Population 4.7 million and a population growth rate of 8.5%. Oman is one of the most stable and rich countries of the Arab world, not so rich in comparison perhaps with its Gulf neighbors such as Qatar or Kuwait, but with a GDP per capita of about $20,000, it is one of the most stable countries of the region. The country has a strong oil industry, producing close to 1 million barrels of oil every single day. It also has strong gas reserves, which also count as an important production of the national GDP. With a population of about 5 million people, hundreds of thousands of immigrants came to Oman to participate in the economic dynamism that the country is experiencing, reason for which we will see the following population pyramid. You can see that, like Qatar, Oman has a majority male population, the product of a large part of Asians who came to this country to work, producing a deficit of women in the population. As long as the country continues to grow economically, it will continue to attract immigrants, but eventually, it will stabilize. Thus, the country will have around 5.8 million people by 2050, and by 2100, its population will remain stable. With a GDP per capita of $18,000, Oman will remain a stable country. So, we have reached the end of this list, and there are many lessons that we can take into account. The demographic stage in which most African nations are found resembles that of the Latin American nations in the past and evidently adjusted over time. But the case of Africa is different, since the continent will double its population by 2050 and triple by 2100. At that time, the world will already have 12 billion human beings. Demographic trends in Africa are clearly not too beneficial and should be avoided at all costs. Implementing certain policies can reduce this trend. For example, sex education programs. Countries such as Nigeria, for example, multiplying its population by 10 and being one of the poorest nations in the world, need to change their policies in order to slow down this growth. So what do you think of this list? Were you surprised that some of the poorest nations in the world could multiply its population by 6 to 10 times its current size? What kind of policy would you support to avoid the overpopulation of any of these countries? So I hope you like this video, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this every single week.